She was always the slow one. We just learned to work around her. My father said this to a circle of 6 colleagues at his own retirement party, 30 guests in the room. And then he looked directly at me and nodded, as if I would find it charming, as if I would laugh along, as if 28 years of being his daughter had prepared me to be the punchline at his send-off from Boston University's Department of Political Science, where he had spent 31 years being celebrated as a brilliant man. I raised my glass slightly. I moved to the edge of the room, and I stood there, near the window that looked out over Comave, and I counted the ice cubes in my drink because that was easier than counting the people who laughed. There were 7 of them. I remember every face. What I need you to understand before I go any further is that 3 years later, a single phone call from a woman named Dr. Patricia Holloway would set in motion something my father never saw coming. And he didn't see it coming because he still, genuinely, did not believe he had done anything wrong. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing where you're all listening from. My name is Megan Calloway. I am 29 years old. And this is the story of how the smartest thing I ever did was nothing at all. I grew up in Brookline, Massachusetts, about 4 miles from the university where my father spent the better part of his adult life being admired. Dr. Robert Calloway was the kind of man who got better looking and more confident with age, who wore his salt and pepper hair like a credential, who laughed at his own anecdotes before he finished them because he already knew they were good. He had a gift for a room. People leaned in when he spoke. I watched it happen my whole life. At dinner parties, at faculty gatherings, at the kind of Christmas events where someone always brought a really good burgundy, and everyone stood around the kitchen island, making the world sound manageable. I watched him work a room the way other people watched athletes or musicians, with a specific kind of awe that is mostly just recognition that you are seeing someone do the thing they were built for. My mother, Claire, was a high school English teacher in Newton, who was patient and warm, and perpetually slightly tired. She and my father divorced when I was 11, after which he moved into a faculty apartment, and my mother stayed in our house, and we, meaning my brother Nate and I, shuttled between them every other week for the better part of 5 years. Nate was 2 years older than me and took after my father in almost every visible way. Quick with words, confident in a room, easy to be around. People noticed Nate first. They always had. I was quieter, more interior, the kind of child who reads at the dinner table when the adult conversation becomes abstract. I was not slow. I was somewhere else entirely, and there is a difference, but my father had never found it interesting enough to investigate. The narrative that took hold early was simple. Nate was the sharp one. I was the one you had to repeat yourself for. My father never said it cruelly in those years. At least, not deliberately. It came out in small, offhand ways. A hesitation before answering my questions. A glance at Nate when he wanted confirmation that something was correct. A habit of finishing my sentences, not because he was enthusiastic, but because he was impatient. By the time I was in high school, I had learned to be very quiet around him and very loud inside my own head, which is, I think, exactly how certain kinds of people become very good at certain kinds of work. I graduated from Brookline High in 2013 with a 91 average, which my father described to relatives as solid for her. I went to UMass Amherst for my undergraduate degree in communications, which he described to colleagues as not quite what we'd hoped, but she's finding her footing. I paid for 60% of that degree myself, working 22 hours a week at a campus library and living on a monthly food budget of $140 and whatever my mother could send. My father contributed the remainder of my tuition, which I was grateful for, and which he referenced in conversation approximately 4 times a year for the next 8 years. That is the economy I grew up inside. That is the exchange rate between us. The retirement party was in May of 2021, held at a faculty colleague's home in Jamaica Plain, A beautiful old Victorian with a back garden and string lights, and the kind of caterer who puts exactly 4 items on each plate and calls it elegant. I had driven down from Amherst, where I was by then enrolled in a graduate program in organizational communication at UMass, something I had not yet told my father in full detail because I had learned, years earlier, that sharing plans with him before they were completed only gave him time to voice doubts that had a way of lodging themselves in me like splinters. I was wearing a navy wrap dress I had bought at a consignment shop on State Street for $32, and I had driven 2 hours in a car with a slow coolant leak that I was monitoring carefully because I had $412 in my checking account and could not afford a tow. I wanted to be there. He was my father. He had spent 31 years at that university, and he deserved to be celebrated. And whatever complicated thing lived between us, I was not the kind of person who let that keep me from showing up. I arrived at 7:15, found my father near the fireplace holding a glass of scotch, and already mid-story, kissed him on the cheek, got a glass of sparkling water from the kitchen, and began making my way around the room saying hello to the faces I recognized. A woman named Eleanor Marsh, who was in her late 60s and had been a senior lecturer in the department for many years, found me near the bookshelves and squeezed my hand and said, "You look like someone who has been working hard." She said it like it was a compliment, which it was, and which told me she was paying closer attention than most people in that room. I had met Eleanor twice before at department events, and both times she had asked me specific questions about what I was actually doing with my life. Not the vague parental-approved summary version, but the real version. And both times she had listened to the answer. I liked her immediately, and both times forgot to say so. Around 9 o'clock, I found my way to the outer edge of a circle of people near the back window, drawn there because my father's voice had gotten louder in the particular way it did when he was performing for people whose opinion he valued. He was telling a story about a family trip we had taken to Washington, D.C. when I was 12. I remembered that trip. What he said was, "She was always the slow one. We just learned to work around her." And then he looked at me and nodded. The circle laughed. I raised my glass slightly. I took 3 steps to the left and stood near the window. What would you have done in that moment? Would you have said something? I want to know. Because for a long time afterward, I asked myself whether my silence was dignity or cowardice, and I still do not have a clean answer. What I know is that I stood near that window for 4 minutes by the clock on my phone, and then I said goodbye to Eleanor Marsh, who looked at me with an expression that was not pity, but was something adjacent to it, something that said she had heard. And then I drove home in the dark with the heat gauge slightly higher than I liked, and I did not tell anyone what had happened because I did not have the language for it yet. That is the thing about a certain kind of hurt. It does not announce itself clearly. It just settles. I finished my graduate degree in May of 2023. It was a Master of Science in Organizational Communication from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and I completed it with a 3.89 GPA, while working 27 hours a week as a communications coordinator for a mid-sized nonprofit in Northampton called the Pioneer Valley Literacy Coalition. My thesis was on institutional communication patterns in hierarchical academic environments, which my advisor, Dr. Patricia Holloway, described in her written evaluation as one of the most rigorously argued pieces of applied research to come through this program in the past decade. I kept that evaluation in a folder on my laptop desktop. I read it occasionally on the kinds of days when my father's voice was louder in my head than usual. Patricia Holloway was the department chair, and she was, by any measure, a formidable person. 64 years old, originally from Baltimore, with short silver hair she kept precisely cut, and a habit of being exactly as direct in conversation as her written feedback suggested. She wore the same style of reading glasses in every meeting, wire-rimmed and slightly oversized, and she had a laugh that surprised you because it was bigger than her frame suggested. She had agreed to serve as one of my thesis advisors after reading a conference paper I submitted in my second semester. And over the following 2 years, she had become something closer to a mentor than an advisor, in the specific way that certain people who are very busy choose to invest their time in you, and you understand, without being told, that you should not waste it. I did not waste it. I turned in every draft on time. I came to every meeting having already answered the question she was about to ask. I was not the slow one. I had never been the slow one. I was the one who had learned to work twice as hard because she had been told for long enough that she needed to. In the fall of 2023, I applied for a division director position at a regional communications firm in Boston called Aldgate Strategic Communications. It was a real job, the kind I had been aiming at for years. Director of Organizational Development, overseeing a team of 11 people, a salary of $92,000 a year, full benefits, and the chance to actually build something instead of only supporting what someone else had built. The process was thorough. There were 3 rounds of interviews over 7 weeks, a written case study, and a presentation to the senior leadership team. At the end of it, they called me on a Wednesday afternoon in November and offered me the position. My friend Jess, who had been my closest friend since our second year at UMass and who had listened to more of my story than anyone living, was sitting across from me at my kitchen table when I took the call. When I hung up, she did not scream or jump up. She just looked at me very steadily and said, "Yeah, obviously." That was the most Jess thing she had ever said, and it is the thing I think about when I need to remember that some people understand you completely. The offer was contingent on a reference check, which was standard procedure. I had listed 3 references: Patricia Holloway, my supervisor at the Literacy Coalition, and a professor from my undergraduate program whom I had stayed in contact with over the years. As a secondary contact, listed under emergency information on the intake form, I had included my father's name and a phone number that, apparently, still routed to his former department office. I had filled out that form 2 years earlier during the graduate program enrollment process and simply carried it forward. I had not thought about it. That is the thing about accidental discoveries. They do not come from scheming, they come from paperwork. Patricia's office, in the process of conducting the routine reference check, located my father's name in my graduate file. This was the contact field, not the reference field. But the number listed was the Political Science Department main line, and when her assistant called, it still connected to that office. My father had retired in May of 2021. He had not, apparently, updated his forwarding information. His former assistant, a woman named Donna Ferraro, who had worked in that office for over 20 years and who by all accounts ran the department with quiet precision, took the message. The message was, calling from the University of Massachusetts Amherst regarding a reference inquiry for Megan Calloway graduate program. Donna wrote it down, thought it was a general academic inquiry, and posted it to the Political Science Department's retirement group chat, where approximately 14 former and current staff had remained loosely in contact since the pandemic. She included the message text because she thought someone in the group might know who to forward it to. She realized within about 30 minutes that it was a private reference inquiry and that it had been posted in error, and she deleted her message. But by that point, 4 people in that group chat had already seen it. One of them was a current lecturer who knew my father. One of them was Eleanor Marsh. I did not know any of this had happened. I was, at the time, in the middle of my second week of onboarding at Aldgate Strategic, learning the internal project management system and attending back-to-back orientation meetings and eating sad desk lunches out of a container I had packed the night before. I was tired in the good way, the kind of tired that comes from finally doing the thing you prepared for, and I was not thinking about my father or the retirement party or the 7 people who had laughed. Jess texted me around noon on a Thursday to check in, which she did almost every day, not because she needed to, but because that was who she was, and I texted back a photo of my office view, and she sent back a single period, which between us was shorthand for, "This is correct, continue." I was fine. I was more than fine. And then, 11 days after I started the job, I got a phone call from Patricia Holloway. She called my cell phone at 4:47 on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unusual because she typically emailed. I picked up immediately. She said, "Megan, I need to tell you something that happened, and I want you to hear it from me." What followed was a 10-minute conversation that I can reproduce almost verbatim because I was standing very still in the stairwell outside my office, not moving, barely breathing, just listening and recording every word in the part of my brain that has always been very good at this specific task. She told me that during the standard reference process, an accidental contact had been made to a number associated with my father's name in my graduate file. She told me that the message had been posted in error to a group chat and then deleted, but that it had been seen by several people, including Eleanor Marsh. She told me that Eleanor had called her. She told me what Eleanor had said. Eleanor had told Patricia that she had been present at my father's retirement party in May of 2021. She had told her exactly what she had heard him say. She had described the room, the number of guests, the moment I raised my glass and moved to the edge. Eleanor Marsh had carried that evening in her mind for 2.5 years, and when she saw that message in that group chat and understood what it implied, she had picked up the phone and called the department chair of my graduate program and said, "I want you to know who you recommended, and I want you to know what her father said about her in front of 30 people." I stood in that stairwell for a long time after the call ended. I was not crying. I was doing something that felt like the opposite of crying, which is a kind of absolute stillness that comes from being seen accurately for the first time in a room you didn't know you were in. Eleanor Marsh had stood up for me. She had stood up for me at her own risk, calling a person she did not know well, making a statement that could have been interpreted as petty or personal, and she had done it anyway. Because she had been in that room in Jamaica Plain and she had not forgotten. I want to ask you something. Has anyone ever done that for you? Has a person who owed you nothing, who barely knew you, stood up and said your name into a room where it mattered? If they have, you know what that felt like. If they haven't, I hope someday they do. Patricia's response to Eleanor's account had been measured and specific, in the way Patricia's responses to everything were measured and specific. She told me she had already completed her reference call for Aldgate before the group chat incident, so my employment was not at risk. She told me she was calling because she believed I had a right to know what had happened, including the accidental contact, the group chat post, and Eleanor's call. She told me one more thing, which was that she had included in her written reference to Aldgate a section specifically addressing the quality of my analytical thinking under professional pressure, and that she had described it in writing as exceptional and consistently underestimated by those who mistake her composure for limitation. I asked her later if she had written that before or after Eleanor's call. She said before. I believed her. That is who Patricia Holloway was. My brother Nate called me 3 days after the group chat incident. He was not in the chat, but someone who had told someone who told him. He called at 11:15 on a Friday night, which told me everything about the state he was in when he dialed. He said, "I heard about the party comment, about what Dad said. I waited." He said, "I was standing right there. I laughed." There was a long silence. He said, "I don't have an excuse for that. I was there and I laughed, and I have been thinking about it ever since that night, and I didn't call and I should have." This was not a redemption. Let me be clear about that. A phone call 2.5 years later, prompted by the fact that the story had started to circulate, is not the same as having been the person who stood up in the room. Nate knew what he had done. He was telling me he knew. That is a different thing from being sorry in any way that costs something. I told him I heard him. I told him I appreciated the call. I did not tell him it was all right because it was not all right. And I have never believed in saying things that are not true, just to make a room easier to be in. That, I suppose, is the one thing I learned from my father that I am actually grateful for. My father found out about the group chat from the same person who had told Nate, a current lecturer in the department, who had apparently decided that Robert Calloway deserved to know that his name had been circulating in an unflattering context. My father called me on a Saturday morning in late November at 9:22 while I was making coffee and listening to the radio. He did not open with an apology. He opened with, "I understand there's been some sort of misunderstanding involving your graduate program." I poured my coffee. I sat down. I told him there had not been a misunderstanding. I told him what had happened in precise order: the contact, the group chat, Eleanor's call, and what she had said. I told him I was not calling it a misunderstanding. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Eleanor has always had opinions she wasn't asked for." I said, "She was asked. By Dr. Holloway, who is the chair of the program from which I just graduated with honors." Another pause, then he said, "I hope you're not planning to make this into something it isn't." I said, "I'm not making it into anything. Other people are talking about it. I am talking to you." He said, "What I said at the party was a joke, Megan. You know how I am." I said, "I know exactly how you are. That's the point." He raised his voice then. He said, "I have spent 31 years building a reputation at that university, and I will not have it undermined by a story that has been completely blown out of proportion by someone with an agenda. I want you to hear that. I will not have my reputation undermined." 30 guests present, his own retirement party, his own daughter, and his concern was his reputation. I did not say anything else of substance in that call. I told him I needed to get on with my morning. I let him have the last word on the logistics of hanging up. I was not there for a fight. I was there for him to hear, clearly and without confusion, that I knew what had been said, and I knew who had heard it, and I was no longer willing to pretend otherwise. That is not revenge. I want to be precise about this. Revenge would have required me to do something. I didn't do anything. I raised my glass slightly and moved to the edge of the room, and then I got a graduate degree, and then I got a job, and then the world, in its own time, did what it does. I was not the instrument of his discomfort. He was the instrument of his own discomfort. He always had been. The group chat post had already been deleted by the time it reached the wider department social network, but the content had not. It spread the way these things spread in academic communities, quietly and thoroughly, person by person, in the specific register of people who are very careful about what they put in writing. Several of my father's former colleagues who had been at the retirement party apparently reconnected with each other about it. I know this because Eleanor told me. She called me herself 2 weeks after Patricia's call, having gotten my number from Patricia with my permission. She was 71 years old, retired from the department herself by then, living in Somerville. She said, "I want you to know I didn't do it to start anything. I did it because I was in that room and I knew what I heard, and when I saw your name in that message I thought, someone should say something while it still matters." I told her that it had mattered. She said, "Good. Now tell me about the job." We talked for 40 minutes. She had strong opinions about organizational communication as a discipline, several of which I disagreed with, and we argued about them in a way that felt completely natural and very good. Before she hung up, she said, "Your father is a brilliant lecturer. He is also, and I say this having known him for many years, someone who has never fully understood the difference between having an audience and having a family." I wrote that down afterward. I have not forgotten it. I have been at Aldgate Strategic Communications for 8 months now. My team is 11 people, and I know all of their names and the names of their partners and their children where applicable, and I do not, under any circumstances, use their limitations as material for my own entertainment. I know that sounds like a low bar. I have come to understand that it is not. The division I run handles organizational change communication for mid-market clients across the Northeast, and we are, by the most recent internal metrics, the highest functioning division in the firm. I do not say that to brag. I say it because for 28 years someone told a story about me that was not true, and I would like the true story to be on the record somewhere. My father has not called since November. Nate and I have spoken twice, briefly about neutral things. I have not called any of my father's former colleagues. I have not posted anything. I have not asked anyone to think less of him. I have simply continued to exist in the way I have always existed, which is quietly and with great precision and without asking anyone's permission. Word spreads on its own. People who were in that room in Jamaica Plain remember what they heard. Some of them have, I understand, become more circumspect in their praise of Robert Calloway at the kinds of dinners where names are mentioned and reputations are assessed. I observe this from a distance. I did not engineer it. There is a difference. Jess came over on a Friday night in January with a very good bottle of wine and the ingredients for pasta carbonara, which she made herself while I sat on the kitchen counter and talked. We did not talk about my father for the first hour. We talked about her job, which she had recently left for a better one, and about a book we had both read, and about a television series she was 3 episodes ahead of me on, and kept almost spoiling. At some point, after the pasta was done, and we were sitting at my kitchen table with the overhead light dimmed and the winter street quiet outside, she said, "How are you, actually?" I told her. I told her all of it, including the parts that were still complicated, including the fact that I had not forgiven my father, not in the clean and total way that would let me close the file and stop thinking about it. I told her that I was not sure I ever would, or that I needed to, and that I had recently come to the conclusion that forgiveness is sometimes the right tool, and sometimes it's just what people ask of you, so that they can feel better about not having to witness your unresolved feelings. She listened to all of this, and then she picked up her glass and said, "To Eleanor Marsh, who apparently has excellent timing." We drank to Eleanor Marsh. I mean that literally. I have thought about sending Eleanor a note, but I have not yet, and I think the reason I haven't is that what she did doesn't feel like the kind of thing that should become a transaction, where I express gratitude, and she accepts it, and we both move on. What she did lives in a category of its own. She was in the room when no one stood up, and she stored that in herself for 2.5 years. And then she stood up when it counted. I do not have a word for what that is. I just know I would like to be that person for someone someday. I would like to be the one who is paying attention. I have not fully forgiven my father. I want to say that clearly, because I think honesty about the limits of recovery is more useful than a tidy ending. There is a door between us that is currently very nearly closed. It is not locked. I have not decided yet whether that is generosity or caution, or simply the fact that I am 29 years old and still figuring out which relationships in my life I am building and which I am maintaining out of obligation. What I know is this: I am not the slow one. I was never the slow one. I was the one watching and taking notes and driving home with the heat gauge slightly higher than I liked and paying my own way and writing a thesis that got described in writing as one of the most rigorously argued pieces of applied research to come through this program in the past decade. I was the one standing at the edge of the room in a navy dress from a consignment shop while 7 people laughed at a joke made at my expense. And I was the one who showed up anyway, because I have always shown up, and I will keep showing up, to the things and the people that deserve it. I want to ask you one last thing. What do you do with a person who diminishes you in public and then tells you it was a joke? Do you leave? Do you stay? Do you stand at the edge of the room and count your ice cubes and wait for 3 years and let the world do the work? I would love to know what you would have done. Leave it in the comments. I read everything. Thank you for being here with me tonight. If this story stayed with you, I will see you in the next one. Something is already waiting.